Don't forget the heat.
It seems every year after IndyCar races in Texas, we have the same debate on social media. Half of the fan base hates the race, half of the fan base loves the race, and it's the same complaints all the time. The racing was too close, the racing was too spread out, the tires suck, the tires didn't suck enough, there's not enough downforce, there's too much downforce, there's too many crashes, not enough crashes. Every single spectrum of the fan base reaction you could have expected, you get at Texas, and here we are once again debating whether or not that this race sucked. I will say this about the Texas race. I think in terms of a aerodynamic package, a racing package that IndyCar has put on the track, it's the best it has been probably in about 10 years since the first few years of the IRL racing at Texas. I would say those were probably the best years in terms of racing overall quality, but I would say this is the best since then. It wasn't a pack race. Many people, several people, are very upset about that, considering the expectations that were kind of built up after last year's race. But at the same time, it really wasn't an Indianapolis-style race where it was single file, not a lot of opportunities for passing once the green flag had been out for a couple laps. We did not see that effect that we had seen in Indianapolis. The cars were able to pass well into a stint. It seemed like setup meant a ton in terms of the tire wear. Now, of course, we'll get into the tire wear later on, but it also meant big gains, whether you were positive going towards the front if you had a good setup, or if you're headed towards the back if you had a bad setup. Driver talent very much played into this racing as well. It was not flat out. It was not easy flat out around the Texas Motor Speedway. Most of that, or if not all of that, has to do with the reconfiguration of Texas Motor Speedway. We'll also talk about that later on, because that plays a huge factor in Texas races going forward, because now we've essentially seen two sides of the spectrum on this reconfiguration versus what we used to have at Texas Motor Speedway with a symmetrical circuit in terms of the banking level and corner lengths. We no longer have that at Texas Motor Speedway. But I'd first like to address the folks who were desperate for a pack race, and there were several of them out there. I don't even need to name names. I'm sure you saw me battling with them on Twitter last night, if you follow me on Twitter. There seems to be a certain segment of the fan base, like I mentioned earlier, that has built Texas Motor Speedway up to essentially be the Daytona or Talladega in the most literal sense of the word, or that phrase you could possibly use for IndyCar racing. They expect all 22, 23, 24, 25 cars, however many are in the race, to be packed together for the entire race. And you would expect that they would hope there is some passing in there and some close-fought competition. And I saw some people pretty blatantly admit that they looked for wrecks tonight. They wanted to see a big wreck. They wanted to see cars spinning and crashing into each other. And that sounds an awful lot like NASCAR plate racing to me. And if you haven't been following the channel recently, or even in the last 6 months, you should well know my thoughts on that style of racing at this point. Suffice it to say, I'm not a big fan, and certainly the drivers, and I would imagine after last year the teams, are not a big fan of artificially creating a gigantic pack of cars where you're going to see the amount of risk-taking take an incredible increase, an incredible rise. And I think that's why people, to be fair, like the plate style of racing, restrictor plate style of racing, is because it definitely ratchets up the intensity levels, certainly ratchets up the heart rate level, not only of the competitors in the race, but the folks watching at home on TV. But at what cost? At what cost? Last year, thankfully, there was no long-lasting human cost, but It costed, something like Robin Miller reported, $3 million worth of crash damage last year to pack race like they did in terms of the crash damage. There was a 10-car pileup, which is almost unheard of in IndyCar racing in any era. You could probably count on 10 fingers the amount of times that there has been an over 10-car pileup in IndyCar racing. It simply doesn't happen all that much, and it happened last year. So especially after Vegas, I hate to bring up Vegas in an argument sense because it opens up a lot of negativity and certainly negative emotions. But you look at Vegas and you look at the situation that was caused there, that was simply a pack race situation. Sure, the cars had a tendency to take off, and I think that has more or less been addressed at this point in terms of the development on the current DW12 chassis that IndyCar uses. But at the same point, I understand, and I am, as again, you longtime viewers will know at this point, I am very much an old school racing fan. I like sex being safe and racing being dangerous. But at the same time, I'm not a big proponent of increasing that level of risk. This is a dangerous sport. It's a blood sport. I'm willing to admit that. Part of the excitement is the fact that, hey, people could die today. And that's kind of what separates those men and women behind the wheel from the people just sitting back and talking about it. That's why these drivers like AJ Foyt, Mario Andretti, and even more modern days we'll talk about later, like Scott Dixon, are kind of head and shoulders above the dirty, unwashed masses because they're willing to put their lives on the line to race for glory and to a certain extent also race for our entertainment, though at least in IndyCar racing and throughout the majority of motorsport, that generally isn't the point. This is kind of my whole argument against the whole racing is entertainment thing. I mean, these are people's lives. It's not just an entertainment sport. If you want an entertainment sport, maybe go watch esports or something where folks aren't actually putting their lives, minds, bodies, careers, families, mental health on the line to compete. This is not what it's about. And when you advocate for purposefully putting the drivers and teams, and to a certain extent their family and their fans, in a position where it's much more stressful and they have to take so many risks, I have a hard time making any kind of a positive move in that direction. It's just ridiculous. It's the argument that we've been making against pack racing for such a long time at this point. I even made those arguments prior to the 2011 Vegas race. I thought it was very stupid that they were racing like that. And by the same token, like I said earlier, I don't think this was a bad race. You saw cars being able to pass relatively easily if you had a better car. The problem with Texas Motor Speedway now, and it was pretty apparent last year, and it's certainly apparent this year, once they've gotten what I consider to be the perfect package, and had they run this race in 2016, we'd probably be talking about it as an absolute classic. But the difference between 2016 and 2018 was the 2017 renovation of Texas Motor Speedway, which lowered the banking in turns 1 and 2 and also widened it. What that did was it created a one-groove racing line, a pretty hard and fast one-groove racing line in turn 1. And what that does is essentially turn Texas Motor Speedway into a Pocono-style racetrack where you have different corners with different lengths and different banking. The reason it works at Pocono, and particularly IndyCar racing is so good at Pocono, is because you have those long straightaways where if you can get the guy ahead of you to make a mistake, or if you simply drive through the corner better, you have a nice long straightaway where you can pull up alongside and make a pass on somebody. At Texas Motor Speedway, it's not that way. The longest straightaway is the back straightaway, and it's really not that long. You only have a 1.5 mile circuit length to have a decent sized straight. And at Texas Motor Speedway, of course, there's the tri-oval and the dogleg area, which reduces the size of the straightaways and reduces the amount of time the drivers are full throttle or able to confidently get alongside each other. I think side-by-side racing was fairly easy to do, relatively speaking anyway, in 3 and 4, and if the track was still a symmetrical racing circuit, I think we would have seen passing the whole way around the track because they could have passed in the corners. the way turn 1 is now is that it's a very much driver-centric corner. It's about how big your intuition is, I guess you could say, to be a bit clean. Going down into the first corner, how late do you want to brake? How late do you want to lift off the throttle? Can you drive around the outside? A few people tried it, notably Alexander Rossi, who ended up having the front end of his car wash up. But again, this version of Texas Motor Speedway, if you are going to blame something for, if you didn't like the race and you're going to blame it on something, blame it on the track reconfiguration. It's not the cars. This is not a car issue. You could argue it's a car issue at Indianapolis this year for sure. They didn't get the downforce level right. I think we can accept that at this point. I think IndyCar got the downforce level right for this type of a race, especially when the track cools off, when the sun goes down. They started running laps around 222 miles an hour to finish the race. You don't want to pile more downforce on because you're going to not only have faster speeds with that downforce, but you're also, again, going to pack the cars together. It seems like with this new version of Texas Motor Speedway, essentially you're going to have to strike a compromise. Do you want a race like we saw today where, sure, it may be a little more spread out than generally some of the harder core oval fans, I guess you could say? We'll get to that real quick here in a second. Or do you want a more legitimate race where, yeah, sure, passing can happen, and it's possible, certainly with a better car, better driver, better setup combination. I just don't know. It's a tough thing because if you pile too much downforce on, you turn it into a pack race. And as Sebastian Bourdais said on Racer.com, you're going to kill somebody if you do that. And does IndyCar really want to increase the chances of having the third death in 6, 7, 8 years? I don't really think you want that on your conscience, and certainly not on your series. And there's the question of the oval fans who are, and I don't even want to call them fans. It almost seems like they're like sadists who want to see people get hurt. I really don't understand the desire to see the cars packed together, and certainly the people who are like, oh, we want more wrecks. I don't know. Do you really want to see more hard crashes like Ed Carpenter took today? It's one of those things where you look at it and you say, where did these people come from? Again, I guess I have to blame NASCAR plate racing for that, because that's the only place I can see. Because if you go to a local short track and you go to a USAC open wheel race or something out in Pennsylvania, and you watch an open wheel race on pavement or dirt, you're not seeing a pack race. You're seeing a race where 2, 3, 4 leaders are able to take a big lead, are able to use their driving skill and their car setup and car preparation. Heck, sprint car racing ain't spec, unlike IndyCar racing. And they're able to build up a lead, and then it's about working through the lap traffic, running consistent laps, running fast laps. That's what oval track racing, specifically in the open wheel divisions, has been always about. It's never been about pack racing. That's only been kind of a recent thing when the Indy Racing League decided it was a good idea to try to ape everything from NASCAR. You saw how that worked out for them and how it's working out for NASCAR right now. It's not a sustainable business model to crash cars, kill drivers, and for what? 30,000 people that showed up at Texas Motor Speedway and maybe the 500,000 people that watched on NBC Sports Network. Is that really worth the cost? I would say no. So the race began with the usual questions in the air, as we all had you always hold your breath before the start of Texas because you just never know what's in store for the end of the race. And early on, we saw quite the situation with Matheus Leist catching fire. Now, of course, I made fun of this in the intro, but this was a very scary situation at the time, as we've seen at Texas in the past. Simona Di Silvestro caught on fire after hitting the wall, and of course, we've seen fire just in general not really been the best thing to see at auto races. It's kind of interesting. I said this on Twitter. It's kind of like a throwback to see fire really actually factor into something like this. It was a very scary situation. It's not something you see very often, and I'm glad that Matheus Leist was able to get out of there. Problems kept moving on for the Foyt team because Tony Kanaan had something break in the rear end of his car. He slapped the wall. He was running pretty well and probably would have been pretty good towards the end of the race. It seemed like his car was pretty light on downforce, which would have been fast towards the end, but I don't know what's going on with the AJ Foyt team specifically at Texas Motor Speedway. The only thing I can kind of make an assumption on is it's still Texas Motor Speedway still feels it owes some karma for AJ stealing the trophy in '97. And then we saw a similarity with Indianapolis in that lap cars really created a lot of action as the green flag runs kind of moved on. You saw guys like Max Chilton and Gabby Chavez and a few other of the back markers really creating some interesting situation for the lead lap cars. And once again, I say that's part of oval track racing, open wheel oval track racing. That's kind of the point, is the ability to navigate lap traffic. I quite enjoyed that portion of the race, though it certainly gave us some very hairy moments. Speaking of hairy moments, Zach Veach, the guy was hanging it out. This was the first time Zach Veach looked like not only a strong driver, but a race-winning contender. Absolutely sent it on a few corners, but unfortunately he sent it a little too hard going out of turn 2. He also slapped the wall just like Tony Kanaan. Now there's a bit of a question of whether or not his car broke under those circumstances, and we're still not entirely sure on that one. And then there was Team Penske. They were dominant early on in the race, but as the race wore on, there were tire troubles that started to hit the Penske team. Now, we've seen this before on banked oval tracks. The Penske tire wear has never been all that great. They had tire failures at Phoenix 2016. They also were the team that really had the most dramatic tire failures in last year's Texas race. Remember, the thing that brought on the competition cautions last year was Helio Castroneves blowing a tire and hitting the turn 2 wall. I actually feared that IndyCar was once again going to have another competition caution situation in terms of the tire wear, but it seemed like really the worst blistering was seen on the Penske team. So for whatever reason, Penske must run very aggressive either tire pressures or, I suspect, their custom dampers and spring package kind of hurts them in terms of tire wear on these banked circuits, at least when it's hot or when the conditions aren't perfect. Now, that wasn't the only problem that the Penske team had. The other problem was the Chevy engine in the back of their car. It didn't quite have the it does have the horsepower, but that horsepower comes at a cost, and that cost is fuel economy. I kind of find it interesting that how about this? It's funny that everybody always wants the cars all to be the same, but if the cars had all been the same today or tomorrow or yesterday when this race was run, Penske would have run away with this race, no questions asked, but because they get to run their own setup and they get a Chevy engine, they went from being dominant to most of their cars being 2 laps down. And this is where we enter the Oval Meister, Wiki Bobby. My goodness, Robert Wickens, dude. I don't know where well, we know at this point. How about this? We've said this before, and we'll say it again, and I think we'll be saying it for a long time. Robert Wickens, man, what an impressive rookie debut. And today, it looked like he was really piling it on. He was able to pass all of the Penske cars who were admittedly fuel-saving. But in a race where, again, everybody was bitching that nobody could pass, Robert Wickens and several other drivers were proving that completely wrong. And Wickens actually got out to a pretty big lead, and it looked like he was about to take his first long-awaited, it seems, after this season, IndyCar win. But the pit crews had something to say about it, and most notably, it was Scott Dixon's pit crew, like we saw at Detroit, just simply doing better in the pits than the opposition, getting him out way, way out in front of Robert Wickens. And that was another kind of talking point about this weekend was the pit speed limit. They had the drivers stay on the pit speed limit all the way down through the apron and back out onto the racetrack. I don't mind that. I think it's a safety issue. I don't think it really contributed anything unsafe to the race. And on top of all of that, it kind of nullified the wave around rule, because if you pitted under green and a yellow came out, you were still 2 laps down. And even if you get a wave around, you're still 1 lap down. So across the board, I felt like it was a good thing. The drivers were able to handle the kind of slow acceleration onto the back straightaway just fine. It all worked out. It created a safer racing environment, and it created a more legitimate race. I'm fine with that. But it all fell apart for Robert Wickens. A bit of a rookie mistake, and I'll say a bit of a rookie mistake because it really wasn't his fault, and even Ed Carpenter admitted it later on, that as he tried to lap Ed Carpenter, who just never had it today in terms of speed. They came together coming into turn 3, a pretty massive accident, particularly for Ed Carpenter, but obviously Robert Wickens also took a big hit, his second big oval track hit after crashing on the Monday practice session at Indianapolis. Thankfully, everybody was okay. Wickens was pissed, though, and rightfully so, as Ed Carpenter said. Ed was very gracious in accepting the blame for that one, and I don't blame him, or I do blame him, but I don't blame him at all for being very gentlemanly about the whole situation. Now, Paul Tracy, on the other hand, speculated the only reason Ed was being nice to him because he wants to hire him someday, though there was talk also from Paul Tracy that Roger Penske has already been asking about Robert Wickens. We'll see how long he stays at Schmidt. Supposedly there's a 5-year contract. I'm not so sure about that one. And then we had another crash. Zachary Clayman DeMello made a big move on the outside of Will Power, and unfortunately, Will Power's crew was talking to him at this point, so the spotter didn't let him know that there was a car high, and Zachary Clayman DeMello got pinched into the wall by Will Power, who, of course, was actually the defending winner of this race going in. A lot of people forget that for whatever reason. But yeah, Slick Willie P was none too pleased with the situation, but I think some people were speculating that he was going to give some double birds. I would never speculate something like that to Zachary Clayman DeMello. But again, Power was very gracious, accepted the blame for the crash. Unfortunately, IndyCar Race Control decided to hand out a fine or a penalty or something to Will Power after that. I will say this about Race Control, though. I felt they called the race very well. I've been actually very impressed with BJ Novak, or not BJ Novak, that's a guy from The Office. Kyle Novak, the race director, for being a very good race director on the ovals. He handed out some pretty harsh penalties early on in the race for blocking, and then later in the race, we didn't really see a whole lot of it. Certainly, there were some warnings given out for some lesser offenses. But I think they've done a really good job of managing the races so that there are crazy moves and the drivers are allowed to race, but if something too crazy happens, they immediately slap down the penalties. I know I've been critical of them on the street circuits for maybe being a little too laxadays, but I think on the ovals they've done a fantastic job of allowing the race to play out, and at the same time not taking any crap. This was just kind of but it was at the same time it was a weird penalty, and we'll see how it all unfolds with Will Power. I hope they don't take away any points from him. That would be a bit bad. And then we get to Alexander Rossi, who was having a fantastic race once again on the oval tracks. We kind of expect that from him at this point, making all sorts of passing moves throughout the field. And then once we get to some of those late race restarts, like I mentioned earlier, tried to pass Pagenaud on the outside. It didn't work, but it set up a pretty long extended duel towards the end of the race where Rossi was trying to get around Pagenaud desperately. He couldn't quite do it. It was a pretty dramatic battle, and it would have been fun if that had been for the win. And if you look at some of the side-by-side action as they crossed the line, it would have been a pretty close finish had that been for the win. But that was left for Scott Dixon to take. An absolutely not diabolical drive, just a clinical drive by Scott Dixon. Just once again, Dixon really has reestablished himself as if he hadn't already as the guy in IndyCar racing, taking his 44th career win and moving past Michael Andretti on the all-time list in terms of wins at third. An absolutely incredible achievement for Scott Dixon. And once again, we need to kind of step back, like I said, Detroit, and appreciate this. And I think Dixon's even said himself, he appreciates it because AJ, Mario, Michael Andretti, they're all still around. They're all at the racetrack, and they can all appreciate his victories because they are very special. And it doesn't look like they're going to stop anytime soon. And that starts to make me wonder, maybe Mario's win total, I think, is like 71 or something, may be a little bit out of reach, but Mario Andretti is looking more and more like he could be caught by Scott Dixon by the end of Dixon's career. So that will be something we'll be looking at, maybe not this year, but somewhere down the line Could Scott Dixon pass Mario Andretti for second on the all-time win list? It's pretty cool to think that a modern driver has achieved this level of success and is getting that close to that margin. So that was Texas again. Whew. I always feel like I have to rant on these videos, and I guess that's what you guys come for, but good grief. We got Road America in 2 weeks, the 24 Hours of Le Mans this weekend. Lots of IndyCar drivers in that. I'm trying to do a bandwagoner's guide for it. Hopefully that will be out middle of the week, so look out for that. That should be exciting, and I know a lot of people are fans of the bandwagoner's guide, so that will be yet another thing that'll be fun. I got another few videos I'm planning about IndyCar in the meantime, particularly about Fernando Alonso. Yeah, there's the talk about Fred has ratcheted up in the last few weekends. Even David Croft and Martin Brundle were talking about it on the the world feed F1 broadcast this morning. So it looks like Fred's coming full-time next year, so that's going to be pretty exciting, and we'll have a video talking about that hopefully pretty soon. Road America should be a very exciting race. It will be fun to see the second true natural terrain road course on the circuit. Of course, Indy GP was technically a natural terrain road course, but there wasn't much terrain there to really see the universal aero kit work. I think there'll be some high speeds on the straightaways for sure. It'll be interesting to see what kind of aero package some of the teams run, whether or not they take off one of the elements of the rear wing to get more straight line speed down the straightaways. We'll see. Road America is one of the most beautiful tracks, certainly in the United States, possibly the world. And that's always a fun weekend. I think a lot of people enjoy that because it definitely kind of has that vibe of a kart throwback race, even when the aero kits were racing there. So lots to look forward to. Thank you guys so much for watching. This has been David Land on YouTube. If you enjoy the IndyCar Red Pill, enjoy IndyCar content, and enjoy motorsport content, you're in the right place. And if you made it to this far in the video, you clearly are. Hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and let me know down in the comments what you think. I love the debate, love the passion, love the vitriol even. It's kind of fun to argue with the crazies. So thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.